Welcome everyone to a really timely and important presentation, and then time for conversation at the end about the power of mattering, and especially youth mattering. First, I should introduce myself. My name is Sally Manninen. I'm with the Choose to Be Healthy Coalition in the Community Health Department of York Hospital. And here today with me, as always, Gina Brodsky and Stephanie Masters-Plamondon are the two staff. We are a substance abuse prevention coalition. If you didn't already know that, there are many in Maine. We don't get tons of money, but we're still here and we're still working our you-know-what's off to stay engaged with all of you and to bring you important information, even via Zoom. We are recording this, but I hope you stay and follow along. Before I introduce our very special guest speaker, I just wanted to say a little something about this topic and why we're here today. And that is really because over the 25 years that I've been doing substance use prevention, and the 20 plus that Gina has, and the several years that Stephanie has, we've talked about so many different aspects related to this topic. We've talked about protective factors in a child's life that put them at less risk for substance abuse and for violence, by the way, which we don't normally talk about, but is certainly timely today. Then I learned about the asset model of the Search Institute from Minnesota, did a lot of work with their information, as Maine did as well. We've talked about sparks, we've talked about natural highs, and then in the last couple years, with our focus on mental health and helping youth stay connected, we discovered through the Maine Resilience Building Network, and we've got some folks from there joining us today as well, we learned this concept of youth mattering and really liked what they were saying and how they were presenting it. And then, because I care about where things come from and history and research, I Googled youth mattering and where that concept came from, and I came upon Dr. Gordon Flett from York University in Toronto, who had ironically spoken at Maine Resilience Building Network conference last fall. But those of us here had missed it. And I just thought we've got to get him to come back and speak because youth mattering is so important in the work that we do. And I'm going to introduce him now. I'm going to read his bio because I want you to know who he is and why it's a really, it's an honor to have him teaching us more about this topic and why it's so important. So let me just say, Gordon Flett is a professor in the Department of Psychology at York University, where he's the director of the LaMarche Center for Child and Youth Research. He's done some other things at York University. He holds a Canada Research Chair in Personality and Health, and he is a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science. He is known for his influential research on perfectionism and mattering in health and mental health. He recently worked on promoting resilience in collaboration with school boards in Ontario, with an emphasis on the psychology of mattering as a positive force in the lives of children and adolescents. He is the author or co-author of approximately 300 journal articles and 11 books, one of which is about youth mattering. These books include his 2018 book on the psychology of mattering and an edited volume on the promotion of mental health in schools. He also has a 2022 book on perfectionism in childhood and adolescence, published by the APA. His work has received widespread international attention, including coverage on CNN, NPR, and the BBC. He's been interviewed for the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Atlantic, the Washington Post, Currently, there's a reporter from Scientific American who is doing an article about this topic, or a series of articles, and has actually contacted some of us in Maine to include in that article. In 1996, Dr. Flett was recognized as one of the top 25 scholars in psychology based on a number of publications over a 5-year period. And in 1999, he received the Dean's Award for Outstanding Research from the Faculty of Arts at York University in Toronto. And he's also been involved with lots of school systems in Canada, and was awarded a certificate of recognition that I'm mentioning because it's so pertinent to our work, Outstanding Commitment to Community. And he was also honored with a Community and Leadership Award in 2006. He's also a wonderful person to speak with. I've learned a lot just in our conversations about this topic and about his work, especially in abnormal psychology and in youth mattering. And in light of the tragedy yesterday, we were just talking about it before we started. This is a particularly important topic. Without being a researcher or knowing the young man that killed those children and those teachers, I can promise you that I would bet $1 million that he did not feel like he mattered, and he was not connected, and he suffered from trauma, and he had access to military-style weapons, and he wasn't getting the mental health support he needed. I can tell you all those things without knowing anything about what happened or him. And mattering is such an important topic. So without further ado, I'm going to have Gordon take it over, but I'm also going to say he'd like to keep the questions to the end, because then we're going to have a discussion. And but if you have anything that just can't wait, you can put it in the chat. But I'm going to be quiet now, Gordon, and let you take over. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Sally. That was a wonderful, warm introduction. And that's the way I feel about Maine. You know, I've only visited once with my wife, Kathy, but someday got to get back. And I look at this being York University. It's York to York. And I like that connection. And I want to say as well, I admire the work that's being done. I wish other places were so committed to prevention, because obviously it's needed everywhere. Now I got to find a way to get my slide going here. There we go. We're up and running. I don't know if you saw the title. The title was about the power of mattering and harnessing and generating energy. And the cruel irony about that was that we were at our cottage over the weekend and had the most massive storm in Ontario in the last 20 years. And we're without power the entire weekend. So I thought I was kind of punking myself with that title, but it talks about harnessing, generating the power of mattering, the energy of it. And when people are actually in a room, I've never seen a topic of all the psychology presentations that I've never seen a topic that stirs up people and gets them engaged in a way you can feel it, you can see it in the conversations that are taking place. And I think it's just reflecting that this is a concept that resonates with everybody. It has something to do, maybe because they remember that one person who made a difference in their lives, or as on the other side of the coin, because we talk about this as double-edged, and I'll be talking about it this way, where we have the situation of somebody treating us like we don't matter. We know how that feels too. It's like heaven versus hell in terms of that alternate feeling. So today I'm going to go over what mattering is, try to enhance our understanding of it, explain why I think it's so powerful, draw some attention to some alarming data about young people who feel they don't matter just in terms of the numbers. And I come at this a variety of different ways just to make the point over and over that it's such a problem in terms of the sheer number of young people who feel like they don't matter. And then, as I say, try to focus on some ways to put it into action in terms of things that people can do. And I'm very fortunate that I was raised in an extended family with grandparents in the house and my paternal grandmother. So I was very spoiled in terms of having people who, especially as the firstborn in the family, having people who reminded me and make me feel like I mattered. And I reflect on how, such a shame when a young person doesn't feel that way. And I wondered if they were trying to prepare me to actually study this at some point, given the experiences that I was so fortunate to have. So we've already talked about it, so I don't need to belabor the point, but why focus on mattering? I want to just make the point that it has multiple benefits for everyone, young people, students and their families, communities, but also hopefully for you, the people who have attended today, so you can think about its relevance. And there's a few poll questions that have to do with you that we hopefully will be able to unfold with no problem here. What is mattering? It all began as a field in 1981 with a paper by Rosenberg and McCullough. It's essentially the feeling of being important and significant to other people. The person low on mattering feels irrelevant, unimportant, peripheral in the minds of others, which is one of the quotes there. Unfortunately, this paper is tucked away in terms of where it's located in the journal world. So I think the academic community wasn't aware of it. Many needed to be aware of it because it directly relates to their work. But and Rosenberg is a sociologist, and I think that meant that psychology wasn't as aware of this as they should be. There he is. It's the only picture I could find. And as I said, as I get older, I appreciate the importance of blurry pictures. But just an amazing scholar, somebody who clearly was in tune with people. His self-esteem scales, the most widely used in the world. And just there's certain people I've met who are academics primarily who just seem to be in tune with what's going on with people. And if I could time travel back, since he's passed in the early 1990s, I would be having him right up at the top of the list in terms of people I'd love to have that conversation with. Now, I should say we're going to be talking about relational mattering in terms of how you feel important to people in your lives. But Rosenberg was influenced by Fromm, who in 1941, when World War II was unfolding, really introduced the concept of mattering, but he talked about it from a societal level in terms of how people would feel like they don't matter versus what was going on in the world at the time. And I don't know how many people have actually gone back and read his original work, but I found a copy of his book in a used bookstore in Prince Edward Island for $1. And I thought somebody had sent that book so I could read it on my vacation and not do the things that we should have been doing. But in there, Fromm talks about how if you feel like you don't matter, you can respond poorly or adaptively to that feeling of being insignificant in society. And that's a key point that we can underscore throughout this talk and thinking about mattering in general, is that the way it gets expressed can be very adaptive, but as we've already talked about, can also be very malevolently expressed as well. And this then suggests that there's intervention points that we can take on that will try and make it a much more adaptive response to feelings of not mattering rather than those malevolent responses. Rosenberg had different components. I'm not going to go through all of them due to time reasons, but the first main one was the idea of attention. You command the interest of another person so that you feel noticed and heard versus unnoticed and not heard. So there's a cartoon excerpt, if you can see it, I put in there from Charles Schulz, Peanuts, who another person who clearly knew what made people tick, and especially children. This, by the way, is also a tribute to my wife's deceased cousin, Ginny, who had Down syndrome and willed to me, when she passed, her entire original collection of Charlie Brown books. So I get plenty of material that I can insert. And in this case, here's Lucy saying, "So what do you think?" And Charlie says, "What difference does it make? You never listen anyway." "Well, I was just making conversation." "When you make conversation, you have to listen too," says Charlie. And she said, "You do?" And that reflects how frustrated and how people start to feel they're unimportant when they're talking and somebody who should be listening is not listening. Second component related to that is a sense of importance, really defined in terms of somebody cares about you, somebody makes you feel special, so that you feel valued and cherished and wanted versus insignificant, and no one cares if you feel that you are unimportant and irrelevant. Third component that's quite key is the notion of dependence. Sometimes you can get a feeling of mattering because somebody or a group or community clearly needs you and relies on you. so that you have a role, a niche, so that you can make the lives of other people better. And it could be, when we're talking beyond youth, a caregiver role, a mentor role. But the notion of being making a difference in other people's lives means that if you can find these opportunities, you don't have to wait for somebody to treat you properly and give you the sense of specialness and interest in you, but you can potentially generate some of these experiences for yourself through the options that you pursue, if you indeed have options to pursue. Fourth component I just wanted to mention was one that came out of work by Nancy Schlossberg, who I'll be talking a little bit more about later. But this is the idea that you're appreciated. If you feel like you matter, you're appreciated, not just for what you do, but also who you are. You're appreciated as a person. In other words, somebody wants you around. You feel that you're being acknowledged. And this idea of appreciation came from her interviews of adults in a caregiving role who said that, the role obviously is one that's marked with burnout and a lot of upsets that you have to deal with, especially if it's an elderly member of the family who's not able really to express appreciation. You might not feel like you matter in that role if you feel that it's thankless. But and I want to put in a plug here for people to remind themselves that even when somebody doesn't thank them, there's an appreciation there, if not from that individual person, perhaps from a group or the community. And any effort to make somebody feel like they matter, I think, is going to be appreciated at some level. Now, here's a thing to remind you of how appreciation can be overwhelming. If you want to feel better about yourself and life, I always recommend going and watching Mr. Holland's Opus, especially the final scene. If you remember the story, Mr. Holland had aspirations and felt that he had sort of wasted his time as a music teacher. And at the end of the movie, spoiler alert, when the music program is closed due to cuts and he's going to essentially be forced into retirement, his former students come back, including, I think, the governor of the state. And it's such a touching, I defy anybody to not need a Kleenex or two watching this final scene. But what that shows you is the power of when people express that appreciation so that you have mattered in their lives and you have made a difference. And I'm pretty sure that Richard Dreyfuss's reaction in that movie was very heartfelt, because it's easy to project to that situation. Now, what mattering is not, this is a question I get, especially all the time when there's going to be stories about it, or somebody's trying to say, oh, we already know about this stuff, it's all common sense. It's not simply meaning or purpose in life. It's not just a sense of belongingness, which it's often linked with. I say that the difference between those two is that you could be part of a group and know that you belong, but not feel that you're valued or really visible or having much impact inside the group. If you're putting your hand up all the time to speak and nobody's recognizing you, for instance. So mattering has more to do with not just being connected, but having a sense of being valued, of importance, and you're there as a person of worth, and it's being seen that way by others. And one thing that Rosenberg made a key point of saying with McCullough was that it's not equated with self-esteem. They showed in that very first paper that across 4 large samples, that even after you statistically control for self-esteem, the measure of mattering would predict key outcomes beyond self-esteem. And indeed, with each of these, research has been conducted that shows that once you factor in these other correlated constructs, mattering usually predicts above and beyond. And the reason why I believe that is the case is because, and it's important from a treatment perspective or a prevention perspective, if somebody's feeling like they don't matter, making them feel more mindful or more self-regulated, or whatever you want to add to that package, is not going to make a difference if they don't, at their heart of hearts, feel like they matter, that they're valued. And I've seen this in case examples where that is the core thing, and unless that's addressed, the young person is not going to feel better about themselves and about life. Now we have our first poll question. We'll see how this works. I'm very curious to see how you would respond to how important is it to you to matter to other people. Let's see what the tally is. It's okay to be honest if you want to use the other end of the scale too. It's no problem. It's your feeling. So far, it's coming in the way I feel like I should be Steve Kornacki at the big board in the election there, shouting out what the probabilities are. But as we can see so far, maybe some people are still thinking about it or they don't want to answer. That's fine too. Clearly, people are saying it's very important or extremely important as their top two choices. There it goes. It's back again. With a few people saying a little or somewhat. Interestingly, nobody said it's not at all important to them. But I think for most people, you get the sense that yes, it's very important or extremely important. It's certainly something that's part of their self-definition. And I think this is a reason why mattering is a potent predictor in research too. I think sometimes we can ask people about uh, a construct, a variable, and it's not really all that relevant to them. I once had a student say to me, okay, I'll fill out your perfectionism scale, but what if I just don't care about this concept? And I said to the student, you are especially somebody I want to have filled out because it's about individual differences. But this concept seems to have that resonance because it's important to some degree to just about everybody. And that makes asking about it in research very, very relevant to people. Okay, I think we'll move on to the next one. I don't know if I have to do that or
Do you need me to
if you
do
can
the next
advance it. That's I don't know if I don't
do
know if
the
I
next
can.
slide there?
Yeah,
There
I
you
still
go.
have the poll though. There we go. Okay. Now, one of my colleagues in this, and we're going to be in a meeting later this week together, is Isaac Prelatensky, who's down in Florida. He's also worked in Canada and been around the world many places, and he's been studying mattering for a while. And this is a very important distinction that he's introduced is what I've been talking about so far is your perception of having value to others. But when I talked about that sense of being dependent on, he talks about that as giving value to others. And I mentioned through mentoring, volunteering, activism. So that's where the idea that you can generate experiences of mattering for yourself come into play. I don't know if it would totally make up for somebody who feels like they don't matter to their parents or to people they're really close to, but it certainly helps. And research indicates that the more different ways you matter, the better off you'll be. Um, Now, one thing, and my daughter is about to finish her training in clinical psychology, also at York University, was talking to me about data yesterday, and she said her data on extremely lonely students with chronic loneliness during the pandemic said that some of them said that there needed to be reciprocity here in terms of giving value to others, and this is a theme that nobody really has talked about, that when you try to give value to others, it does need to be appreciated, it does need to be well received, and there's a sense of mutuality about it so that you're essentially in things together, so that the person clearly is reflecting that back at you. And you can think about dyads from that perspective, that in the ideal relationship, you matter to them and they know that you matter to you. I don't know if I said that right. Anyway, because what my daughter Allison was telling me was that she had students with extreme and chronic loneliness that said, I give and I give and I give, and nobody seems to care. It never gets reflected back on me. And I think that that's a key thing for us to express thankfulness to people who are trying to fill that role for others and find ways to just reinforce at a broad level that efforts are acknowledged and are important. And that will hopefully address the issues for somebody who's feeling like there's no reciprocal aspect to it. And ideally, I could see youth getting quite cynical if they say, okay, I'm going to try and feel like I matter by making others feel like they matter, but not feeling that any of it's coming back in terms of that. So I think that's a key element to think about going forward. Now, just to underscore this, I was involved with a paper with my new colleague in Michigan, Dr. Summers, and this was a study with 206 high school students in rural Michigan. And they used a measure that we were able to isolate 4 items that tap the sense of mattering by giving to others. And 2 items there are people count on me in times of need. People trust me with things that are important to them. So you're there for other people and you're really giving to others. Compared to mattering defined in more conventional terms, this clearly was a different aspect. And higher scores on these items, there, 2 of the 4 being there, were linked with less loneliness, greater hope, more sense of mastery and self-efficacy in the approach to learning, and importantly, higher executive functioning in terms of cognitive tendencies. And the big payoff for school administrators would be higher grades, so that the students who said they do this actually had higher grades determined objectively by the actual report card. And this would be my point to somebody who's so invested in pursuing achievement, like perfectionistic kids, or parents who want those kids to be absolutely perfect and are pushing them to such a degree, is to say that balance goes a long way, and the sense of feeling good about yourself that comes through giving to others and having that balance will pay off and will probably result in better performance, because extreme focus on achievement and perfectionism can result in too much pressure, burnout, and actually just the opposite of what was the goal in the first place. So just to summarize some concepts we've talked about. So if you feel like you matter, you feel seen and heard, you feel believed in and valued. This is something that people talk about a lot. You know, the person who really believed in them when others didn't, that's the person who really impacts their sense of mattering. Feeling cared for and cared about, which Rosenberg talked about, but it's not got enough attention among the things that he did talk about. And he also did talk about, that sense of, you matter when people let you know that you would be missed if you're not there. If somebody, for a teacher, for instance, knows that a student's been absent, sees the student just saying, "Oh, we're so glad you're back. We missed you," and usually they'll be surprised that it was even noticed that they were gone. Little things like that go a long way. And Rosenberg also talked about feeling wanted, which is another element of his work that seems to have slid by most of the researchers' attention so far. Now, just to underscore again, mattering, here's the 5 items from the scale that Rosenberg worked on with colleagues. And essentially, it's just how much do you agree or disagree with these 5 items, worded all in a positive direction that reflect those dimensions. How important are you to others? How much do other people pay attention to you? How much would you be missed if you went away? How interested are others in what you have to say? And how much do people depend on you? When this is filled out, the maximum possible score is a 20. Most adolescent samples end up with a score around 13 or 12. The lowest score that I've seen on this scale was a large sample assessed during the pandemic with my colleague in Canada, Tracy Vinecourt, who ended up with scores around 10 or 11, which is the lowest score I've ever seen on this general mattering scale. And I tried to convince her and eventually did, since I was the editor of the special issue that we were publishing her paper in, that this was the lowest mean and that we should emphasize this because it also, I think, reflected the lack of social contact and the sense of isolation that kids would be experiencing as they're at home with online learning and not interacting with others, not interacting in person with their teacher, for instance. And I think that's also a general indication of some of the mental health issues that go along with that sense of isolation that's been exacerbated through what we've all gone through. Now, I've been talking about mattering in general, but one of the important things about this, it's a variable with incredible scope, because most research focuses on mattering in general with items like I just described, but you can also talk about domains of mattering. So mattering at home, mattering at work. So a child may feel like they don't matter at home, so it's vitally important that they would matter at school, as a way of trying to compensate for that. And then, of course, mattering in the community. And there has been measures that have been developed for all of these different focuses, that supplement the general global assessments of feelings of mattering. And this is one thing I say about mattering. It's so many uh, there are so many domains that it's relevant to, and so many ways that it can be shown and expressed and experienced, that increases its broad relevance in people's lives as well. And I think also creates opportunities for ways to try and improve it. We're now at our second poll question, and I'll tell you why I'm asking this after we ask it. How important do you think it is for parents to feel like they matter to their kids? Hope you don't think these are loaded questions, but this one was loaded for a reason. So we see extremely important, very important, and the most prominent answer, most prevalent is extremely. I think we're good with that one now. We know how that one's coming out. Now I asked that question because there's virtually no research. There's a qualitative study. There's the final results, 53% extremely, or so, like almost everybody, and at least somewhat, but very or extremely is the most prominent. And I asked that question, I said, because there's very little on parents' need to matter. And I was in a conversation with an acclaimed researcher, Sania Luther, who studies affluenza and kids in high pressure contexts. And she does a lot of work on mothers and the pressures that they're under. And she said to me, you really should start studying the parents need to matter. It's such an uncharted domain. And I'm convinced that sometimes parents feel that they're not having an impact, or they subscribe to the stereotype that when kids hit adolescence, they'd rather just be by themselves. They may never admit it, but they need to know that they matter to their parents perhaps more than ever. So we really need to start studying the sense of mattering in parents. How does that relate to the child's level of mattering? And what can we do to start mattering essentially at the top of the family? Because I'm pretty sure that the parent who feels like they matter and knows ways to express it and to show it will be somebody who has kids that are more likely to find ways to transform that and take those tendencies and then spread that to their peers and to their community as well. Um, Anybody who studies prevention who's been in it for years, I have several colleagues at York University who are in this category, tells me that you've got to start with you've got to have the parents on board, obviously, but I think this is vitally important with respect to mattering. If a parent feels like he or she doesn't matter, you can imagine how that's going to be reflected in interactions. That's going to involve a disengagement, and alternatively, the parent might not be so focused on their children and might be too focused on their own issues. And one explanation that's been put forward for why there's a problem in terms of kids' level of mattering is that when parents are entirely egocentric and are focused only on their own needs, as would be the case with a very narcissistic parent. So we need to get this as something that's shared and starts with parents who are having a sense of otherness directed towards their children and their community, for those who are or don't, and really boost up parents as well in terms of that they know that they too can make a difference even when it feels like they're swimming upstream. Now, the flip side, there's always a flip side, and I alluded to this earlier. The flip side is what I call anti-mattering. This is when you've been made to feel like you don't matter, the feeling that you're feeling insignificant, small, perhaps even invisible. And in a paper with our scale, and I mentioned the scale paper because you can find it, it's open access, anybody can read it. Tried to write it so it was accessible. You can read about the anti-mattering scale. I'll show you some items of this and how we show in that paper and elsewhere that mattering and anti-mattering are not simply endpoints of the same continuum, so that anti-mattering's just the reverse and it's redundant. There's something about the negative orientation that comes from feeling like you don't matter, and people are making you feel this way that really distinguishes it. And in some samples of children, I've been able to find some who say, I feel like I matter based on the general mattering scale. But I also have a lot of people who are going out of their way to make me feel like I don't matter, which sort of, detracts, but it's a very different dimension for them. One movie illustration, I'm going to make a list of movies someday that tap into mattering versus not mattering. One of my favorite movies, The Breakfast Club, there's Ali Sheedy. Most of the focus in the past has been on the character called the Brain, who admits that he's there because he was suicidal and had a flare gun in his locker. The Basket Case, played by Ali Sheedy, they weren't too worried about stigmatizing labels back in those days. Finally, nobody knows why she's in the Breakfast Club, if you know the movie, for the Saturday detention for the 5 of them. And then finally, she's asked, what do your parents do? What did they do to you? Why are you here? And they said, I think it was Emilio Estevez says, if it's bad at home, what do your parents do? And she just says, they ignore me. And essentially then says she is volunteering to be at the Breakfast Club because she has nobody who cares about her on a Saturday. And at least there's people there. That's pretty sad. And that reflects the link that there is between the feelings of not mattering and emotional neglect and lack of engagement and involvement. And sadly, of course, I imagine applies to far too many youth. Very, very astute, once again, John Hughes, to be able to center in on the adolescent who might be feeling that way and experiencing life through the sense of not really being important, not even being noticed. The anti-mattering scale, a few sample items. How much do you feel like you don't matter? Again, just agree, disagree. How often have you been treated in a way that makes you feel like you are insignificant? To what extent have you been made to feel like you are invisible? And sadly, we can measure this with a reliable measure and valid, and it predicts far too many things that we wished it didn't predict, but it's a very destructive orientation. I just want to quickly say that I came up with the concept of antimattering based on the concept of antimatter introduced by world famous scientist Paul Dirac. I came across this book just as the pandemic was starting. Who could not pick up a book with that title if you're in psychology? The Strangest Man, The Hidden Life of Paul Dirac. And I think Sheldon Cooper was patterned after him in many ways. But I mention this because it turns out that Paul Dirac's father was a very cold and harsh man. He was a teacher, as it turned out, and didn't express the parental warmth and connection that he and his brother needed, and his sister. So I think it's just ironic that the person who became world famous for proposing the concept of antimatter in physics was also somebody treated as if they didn't matter. And I had to wonder if somehow he had channeled those feelings in terms of what he ended up calling it. And just to underscore the importance of family treatment and the warmth, sadly, it's revealed in the book that his older brother, who did not get any parental attention, his father treated Paul Dirac like the protege and openly excluded his older brother. Sadly, as a young adult, his older brother took his own life. And Paul Dirac said that that was the first time at the funeral for his incredibly upset, bereaved parents that he realized that his parents actually did care about him and his 2 siblings, because there hadn't been signs of that, especially from the father. So it's just ironic. And that book is well worth reading, whether you're scientific or not, to show you how the interpersonal side of someone's life interferes with and is very separate from the academic and the achievement and the creativity that goes on there. The concept of antimattering really comes from the woman I mentioned earlier, Nancy Schlossberg, who has this well-read paper on the marginalization concept and how putting mattering into action can play a key role for communities. She said, we must build community by combating the feeling of marginalization and not mattering. She was particularly interested in older adult learners who come to university and might feel that they're stigmatized and marginalized because they're out of the norm. I met many of these students when I was our director of undergraduate studies for 3 years. But she's also had a book that's published by the APA that's well worth recommending for anybody thinking about retirement, where she talks about the sense of mattering that you need to retain when you make that transition to retirement. And here's a quote: "The polar themes of marginality and mattering connect all of us, rich and poor, young and old, male and female. Are we part of things? Do we belong? Do we make a difference? Do others care about us and make us feel like we matter?" So she too has really centered in on the importance of this, and kept the focus on mattering going, um, really once Rosenberg passed away in the early 1990s. There was a real long time before active research started to materialize. And it was only around the year 2000 with a paper by John Taylor, who's a Canadian who's now based in Florida, that started to show us the research findings that support these extremely astute observations. Now, one example of not mattering, our national shame in Canada, is what happened in our residential schools, and we're having more and more sad stories emerge about this. But essentially, kids from First Nations communities were just snatched up and taken away to these residential schools with no ceremony, no forewarning. And the person in Canada who's led the charge in terms of making this known to the general public is Phyllis Webstad here. And we have our National Orange Shirt Day. And the color of orange, she said, is picked on purpose because that's the clothing she was wearing the day that she was separated from her family and taken to these schools where many abuses were then taking place. So to her, she said, orange is the color for all those years of not mattering. And imagine that if it happened to you. God forbid that it would happen to anybody, but we know that it did happen. And it's the epitome of not mattering to the extreme, that not just marginalized, but being treated as if you're not really a person who's at all valued. And now, of course, in Canada, I don't know if you've been following Canadian news, but every month or two they find unmarked graves of kids who died while they were at these schools. And the Pope is coming to visit to talk about the role and that of the church. But it wasn't just the church that was involved. There's many denominations and a horrific example. But fortunately, and you see on I don't know if you can read the shirt, "Every child matters" is the slogan on Phyllis's orange shirt there. Some other ways to view mattering have not got a lot of research attention. There's things that I hope to draw attention to by doing research on it. One is the loss of mattering. I don't know what's worse, never mattering to people or never feeling like you matter, or to have a sense of mattering and then to lose it, as you might, for instance, if you had a job loss where you're an important job and now suddenly it's gone. And also, I wanted to get more of a focus on the role of anxiety in mattering by talking about the concept of the fear of not mattering, which is leading us up to our next poll question. But this concept was eloquently expressed in terms of its potential impact in the movie Birdman, which won the Academy Award, when Emma Stone says to her father, played by Michael Keaton, "You know what? You're afraid of not mattering. And you know why you're afraid of not mattering? Because you don't matter." I can't think of a harsher thing to say to somebody, and a way for a child to get essentially, if you want to say, in the grill of one's parent. But this fear of not mattering, I think, is something that might be relevant. So we wanted to ask you about that with the next poll question as well. This is one that I'm just curious whether this is relevant for people. To what extent are you afraid of not mattering to other people someday? I'll be expecting more of a range here, but I'm curious. So we have so far not at all or a little with 10 people. But towards the middle, we have somewhat or very as the two main options, and one person extremely. And this is helpful information for me, because I think that this is the topic that's the next big one for us to study. And I think the field needs to think about mattering in terms of having more of a future orientation. So all told, the top response was somewhat, with a very close second, but I did anticipate more of a range here. We have started studying this with a scale called the Fear of Not Mattering scale, which again has 5 items. One of my students, who is a graduate student, who's been dealing with some health issues, she's older than me. She's come back to university trying to finish up her dissertation. And what's most relevant about this, reason why I'm mentioning this student, is because she has worked in hospices and in end of life situations, and she told me about why this needs to become more of a focus, because of the fact that she said that she's seen people who clearly, when they're looking like they're not going to be with us anymore, really need some sort of reassurance that they mattered to people and that they're not going to be forgotten. And I think that this taps into that fear of not mattering. We have now measured it, as I said, and we know that that fear is associated with loneliness and depression, but also anxiety and worry. Um, and, given some of the treatment that we have seen throughout the pandemic of how older people are treated in facilities, and I have a paper on this that's also open to the general public if you want to check it out, about mattering and the elderly. And there's a chart in there about, I think it's around 10 specific examples of older people being treated as if they're insignificant, unimportant. Rosenberg said that this is a key part. Adolescents and older people, he said, are the two most likely to have a need to matter. And I think this concept just fits into what's going on, in terms of some of the treatment that people have received, and how we need to start ensuring that all older people, everyone, needs to feel valued. And I know that this was an issue for my mother-in-law, who since has passed, because she felt that she had a valuable role when our daughters were younger, but not so much and would be there when they came home from school, for instance, but not so much when they were older. And I tried to convince her that her granddaughters, cherished her and needed her just as much, just in different ways. But I don't know how successful I was in terms of conveying that, because clearly there was an element of dejection there that didn't reflect how people actually felt about her. And this is a key point I've not really emphasized, is that mattering is subjective. It's your perception of whether you matter to others. And this is why people need to show people they matter in ways that are convincing, because people are uncertain about themselves, or maybe dealing with feelings of inferiority or insecurity, will work really hard to try and convince themselves that they don't matter, when in fact they do. So they need to be shown in as many different ways as is possible.
Gordon, this is Sally. I'm going to interrupt you just for a second because we've got a little bit of chatter, I think, about something I'm wondering too. Did you tell us, or do you know what young people or any age person considers some of the more important criteria for mattering, if I'm saying that correctly? So, in other words, did they say, when I'm asked to help other people, when somebody asks my opinion, do you have a sense of what some of those things are?
We get into that, but I'm glad to address some of it now. Number one is somebody really listening to them and seeing them for who they are, not who they think they are or who they want them to be, but really somebody who listens and expresses some care and consideration. And also, youth have said, and I'm going to mention this as well. Um, you
And
know,
and I'm sorry, Gordon, but it seems like you're harder to hear all of a sudden. Maybe you're not
oh no,
leaning
I
into
haven't done
your.
anything.
There you go. There, now we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll lean in. So for the people who couldn't hear me, I said that when they feel that somebody is really listening to them, somebody is not only listening but cares about them, shows some interest in them, like I think one thing you could easily say is, I've been thinking about you, so that they're clearly distinct. And in the 2018 book, I added a key element of this. I was going to mention later as well. This is the sense of like individual attention, that somebody is treating you like you're special, that you are not just a face in the crowd, just a number, that somebody and that could often we see it in terms of also a sense of somebody saw something in me that other people didn't, or looked at me in a way that other people can't seem to for some reason, so that they see them as a unique individual with positive characteristics, and they care about them and they continue to check in on them. So ways like that, and I'll be getting to some other examples as well. Could you hear me all the way through there?
Yes, that's much better. Thanks. And
Okay.
we'll talk about this more at the end when
Yeah.
people share. Thank you for letting me interrupt.
Now, I'll go a little faster and try and make sure we have time at the end. Uh, so why is mattering so powerful? I've been reflecting on this, for the last 4 or 5 years. I think there's many reasons, which I'll get to. But first of all, it involves the self and identity. And whenever you're talking self and identity and how people define themselves, it's going to be very relevant. Obviously, relationships are so important. Mattering can make or break relationships. Um, I say if you don't have a great relationship with somebody, often it's because somebody thinks in the relationship, or both somebodies think they don't matter enough to the other person, or they're not enough. One of the core needs that we have is the need for connection. So mattering helps address that need, but it's clearly not just a need for connection, it's a need to be connected and valued. And mattering is also very important, and Rosenberg talked about this as a key asset to have in terms of life transitions or life challenges. It fosters resilience and adaptability and helps people have a sense of confidence about themselves when they're in uncertain and uncharted waters, that things are going to get better eventually, or they will be able to make things more manageable for themselves over time. Another reason is the power of mattering in terms of its link with correlated factors. This is very robustly linked with hope. And I'm now trying to put more emphasis on the importance of both mattering and hope. Um, Also, the sense of agency that comes from being able to generate these feelings of mattering to others. And research indicates it's also correlated with resilience, grit, adaptability, about any measure you can come up with, essentially, about coping and adjusting. So if a child or adolescent has a high level of mattering, that same child or adolescent will likely feel hopeful, will have a sense of personal agency. It's like in Jeopardy, you've got the daily double, it's like there's all these correlated factors that are all positive that tend to go along with it, so that it's really powerful at an exponential level. Also, Rosenberg talked about mattering as a powerful source of social integration and connection. And I believe, based on what I've seen and work we've done on interpersonal resilience, it provides interpersonal protection and safety from things like negative social interactions, bullying, cyberbullying, negative social influences, peers, could be social media attention that's unwanted, loneliness, which is, of course, is a huge problem as well. So it is sort of like a shield, in a sense, from these things. It's not that these things won't bother a young child who has a sense of mattering is not likely to gonna have internalized negative messages from other people to the extent that someone with a low sense of mattering would, perhaps. Also, the bottom line to me is the power of mattering in terms of its ability to change lives. And this is reflected by the work on the intervention of a caring adult who's transformed the lives of young people. There's a quote from Emmy Werner, who's one of the most well-known resilience researchers. And in there, she talks about the optimistic thing that she's seen, which is encounters for a child or adolescent with people who give meaning to their lives. It was her words, using the his all the time, and who tell him that he matters. And this was based on multiple year longitudinal research that was conducted in Hawaii. Then we have these examples. Most people are familiar with the story of Oprah, I believe, and how her fourth grade teacher, Mary Duncan, really changed her life, which was a life of abuse up until that point. And in her second last show, Oprah paid tribute once again to Mary Duncan, who said, well, she kind of said in this show that, well, I've done this for other kids too, but when you feel it personally and you need it, of course, a teacher can make all the difference in the world. Here's a quote from Oprah: "The yearning to feel heard, needed, and important is so strong in all of us that we seek that validation in whatever form we can get it." Um, Another classic example, both the book and the movie in real life, the story of Blindside, Michael Orr, who ended up being taken in by the Tuohys and became the movie about this as well. And he has talked about the importance of that sense of being important and mattering. Went on, of course, to become a star lineman with the Baltimore Ravens. And there's a quote that he has from his book: "Moving in with the Tuohys was the thing that made it all came true." He did have a family, but they found him wandering the streets and wondered about him. And he didn't have the kind of home life, I guess, that was ideal. He said, "I wasn't just a special project to them. I was a kid who wanted to feel loved and supported, to know that my dreams and futures were just as important as anyone else's." And again, life changing. And I could fill up the entire time with examples like this. Um, I just wanted to transition to the last part of the talk and the prevalence, because I still haven't got to that. But in terms of the power of mattering, something you may not be familiar with that I came across recently was a report from 2021 by a global charitable foundation based in England called Welcome. And this document identified 27 key ingredients for for active intervention to address child and adolescent depression and anxiety. And the ingredients include building self-compassion, important for my other work, perfectionism reduction, but coming in at number 7 on the top 27 was building a sense of mattering. And I'm in the process of writing a book focused on mattering in children and adolescents. And in there, I posed the question: if you rank those 27, where would mattering come out of the 27? I'm pretty sure it would be much higher than number 7 in terms of its potential impact and the power of mattering. So that's a document that's worth checking out. It also has great suggestions and themes for other prevention foci, however you want to pronounce it. And I was pleased to see that. And of course, one of the reasons why I'm particularly surprised there hasn't been more active work on mattering over the past 2 decades is that the US National Research Council, in work by Eccles and Gutman in 2002, identified this as one of 8 essentials for positive youth development: the sense of efficacy and mattering, and providing an environment that can build and give opportunities for a sense of efficacy and mattering. So you would think when that's clearly stated, and it's had an enormous impact, but not as much as it should have in terms of a research focus on mattering, I say there's a big problem. And what is the problem? Well, I've already alluded to that problem, which is the sheer number of young people, depending, when you dice and slice the question different ways, it still comes out the same, that there's far, far too many who feel like they don't matter, or they're not sure if they matter. So this is a survey that was conducted by one of the school boards I was affiliated with, almost 24,000 students in Ontario. Basic question, percentage agreement: I feel like I matter to others. 1 in 5, 65%, so 2 out of 3 said they felt like they mattered. So that's the good news. But the bad news is that more than a third either felt like they don't matter. 1 in 5 said I don't matter. And another 1 in 7 said, well, they aren't really sure. To me, if you're not sure whether you matter, you don't have that sense of mattering clearly. So that signaled to the school board that they've got to focus on ways to increase that feeling of mattering. Here's more recent data from the same school board. Excuse me, I'm gonna take a drink. Percent agreement with the item: I matter to people at school. 13,500 plus students. Male students, 65% agreed that they mattered or strongly agreed to this. Female students, 54%. So there's a difference there. But in a category they generally refer to as gender diverse, using their terminology, only about 1 in 3 felt like they mattered to people at school. And this is a finding I know that's been replicated in the data from Maine and other jurisdictions. Another school board, the exact same thing. So we also have to think about who is most likely or least likely to feel like they matter, and certainly LGBTQ, young people, really especially need to feel like they matter in their community. And this is just one clean example of this. When you think about it, it's an enormous gap between 65 and 54% to 34%. Now, Rosenberg in his 85 chapter, nobody's ever cited this but me, I think. He included the stats from one of the samples, percent of disagreement with I matter to my parents. And by going back, we can see that these data that are decades old now indicate that this is a problem that's not new. I just think it's exacerbated. So in the sample of almost 2,000 adolescents from Baltimore area, 26% 8 to 11-year-olds, and then 29, 12 to 13-year-olds, 29%, and then back to 26% for the older adolescents. So we can infer that at least 1 out of 4 feel like they don't matter to their parents, and that this is something that set them up for other problems based on the results that he then showed. Um, More recently, some data from England, and I'm now collaborating with these people on a supplementary analysis. 311 gifted or talented adolescents defined very broadly, not according to set criteria, and they were asked to complete our anti-mattering scale. And I picked an extreme cutoff and was alarmed to find that 25% of gifted adolescents, so they have, academic credentials and intelligence and creativity that comes with being deemed gifted, felt like they did not matter by a high score on the anti-mattering scale. This is very problematic, I think, and shows you that there's no guarantees that being good academically is going to address the interpersonal. And for adolescent girls, the scores were higher for adolescent girls versus adolescent males. 4 of them had scores of 20 out of 20. And I can't imagine, I don't want to imagine what was going on in their lives, but that's the sort of thing. This was done anonymously, so nobody could intervene, but it suggests almost a cry for help, because how can you feel entirely like you don't matter? You're entirely invisible, entirely without voice and importance. So it's pretty sad. Shows that we've got work cut out for us here. By the way, just as an aside, anti-mattering in this study was correlated with perfectionism and emotional reactions to being perfect. So that's how you see how these things get tied together. Also linked with higher stress and poorer self-regulation for those who were learning at home during the pandemic. So this shows you that anti-mattering spills over and is reflected in a variety of different ways. Some other stats, now we get to the idea of community mattering. And this is summarized in the 2018 book, that this one question about I feel like I matter in my town or my community has been administered as a result of the one broadly used survey across many jurisdictions. And Santa Clara had a 35% feeling like they mattered in the community. It typically is around 50-50. So half of youth feel like they matter in the community, half don't. And it's a Canadian thing as well. There's New Brunswick data. And Maine and Vermont, because they've been focusing on this for a longer period, tend to do better on this variable. You see it's almost at 60% in the 2019 statistics for Maine. And Vermont also almost at 60%, but that still means 2 out of 5 feel like they don't matter in their community. And this would mean they'd be unlikely to seek help from somebody in the community, and probably not be very actively engaged and out and about in the community. I also found this, and I'll just mention this, you can find this, it's a massive report, and again, one that never got the attention that it deserved, but it was a precursor for Eccles and Gutman coming up with their emphasis on mattering. This was a 4-pack of questions rather than one item, where they're asked, in my town or city, I feel like I matter, people make me feel important, people listen to what I have to say, and people don't care about me, as an anti-mattering item. And I believe they didn't provide the details, but I believe this was the percentage agreement who had agreement or disagreement with the last item across all 4 items. Only 1 out of 5 youth in America, based on almost 100,000 from 213 cities, would say that they had a sense of being valued by their community based on these 4 items. So I think this is instructive as well in terms of not just do I feel like I matter, but do people care what I have to say? Do people care about me as well as I matter in my community? This alarming statistic ought to have been enough to get mattering research going for multiple levels and at such a volume, but I only just found these results last week. Why should we be concerned? Well, feelings of not mattering predict academic problems, less success. There's a little bit of research now to suggest physical health problems, so it can affect being likelihood of being ill, and sadly, depression and suicidal tendencies, among other things. And here's a chart that was done based on research in Alaska, where they've been focusing on this for quite a while. And I won't really get into this, but essentially, what it shows is if you focus on the far right on the screen, those who indicate they don't matter in their community have much higher degree of considering suicide in the past year, 35.2%, versus the ones who did feel like they matter, only 10.8%. So there's a protective role, but also a vulnerability if you feel like you don't matter in your community. Now, I just want to say a little bit, and it goes back probably to events yesterday, and we'll find out more, sadly, as time goes by. But Rosenberg also in 1985 talked about the notion of expressing a feeling of not mattering in malevolent ways due to a deep-seated feeling of anger. And in my recent 2022 paper, which is also open access, I talk about the concept of dark mattering, which comes from a brand of psychology that is now looking at essentially the dark side of personality. And there's a great book by one of my colleagues on dark psychology concepts. Anyway, this notion that mattering can be expressed malevolently is reflected back in Rosenberg's work back in 1985, because he showed in this one sample that those who felt that they didn't matter to their parents expressed significantly correlated with feelings of irritability, resentment, an impulse to be aggressive, actual expressed aggression, and a feeling of enemy. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that right today. Too tired. Anyway, I looked at the items, and one of the items really taps right into sense of not mattering. No one really cares about me was built right into the item for that index. And when you think about it, when somebody's feeling this way, they're not engaged in long-term thinking. They could be building up this resentment for quite a long time, which is all we need to know in terms of why we need to reach out and be preventative. Because once somebody shows a young person that they matter, the young person can no longer say, well, I don't matter to anybody. And then they have to start thinking about this in a totally different way that can also provide some comfort that somebody actually does understand them. Now, if you feel like they matter, they have a clear positive orientation for the future that goes along with the sense of hopelessness. And other research that really hasn't been summarized that I'm going to hopefully be writing about shows that there's, if you feel like you matter, less likelihood of abusing substances, which fits in with the initiatives of your organization, less likely to bully and to be violent based on work by Banyard and colleagues, also a tendency to have higher grades, less likely to drop out. And I think this all reflects having a sense of the future and which comes also with impulse control, so that you don't do things that will take away that future. And there's the house phone. So this is the part we start to talk about how we can put this into action, which is really the power of mattering. Mattering is modifiable, so let's promote it. But I want to add, I really think we need to wrap it around more of the concept of hope as well. So we want to promote mattering, but we want people out in the community who are modeling hope and optimism and being able to change and to grow as trying to address some of the pessimism and cynicism that might have even been magnified as a result of the pandemic. And I've seen this put into action. I won't get into it because Sally's already talked about it, but school boards have embraced it as part of their mental health strategy. Some colleagues I know are building it into prevention of youth homelessness. Up in Nunavut, in northern Canada, prevention of youth suicide. And of course, we have some great programs. The national program in the United States for suicide prevention is based on the theme "You Matter," which is probably pretty much all you need to know with respect to its potential for changing things and protecting young people and people of all ages who are feeling suicidal and experiencing emotional pain. And in Canada, we have the We Matter campaign led by these two young people, the Redveers, who decided that they needed to be proactive and try to do things to address the feeling of not mattering among our Native youth and Inuit youth. Um, and our Prime Minister has put on a video on there as well, Prime Minister Trudeau. And amazing work. And when I saw this, I wondered, why is it that so many people in communities who are feeling the pain of not mattering are putting it into action, yet researchers seem to be slow to the party? And I'm glad to see that interest is building research-wise, but I'm even more gratified when I see initiatives such as yours where it's being put into action. Now, I already talked about these things. I won't talk about volunteering more. I'm going to run out of time, but um, one thing I wanted to mention about mattering promotion practices is that there's a value in just highlighting it as a theme, as a value for the community, for the school, for the family, so that people will know, hey, I might not be seeing it in terms of exactly what's happening right now, but everybody counts, everybody values. One of the school boards I work with, that's their slogan, is everybody counts, everybody matters. And that even just highlighting an awareness of it will get young people thinking that, hey, maybe people actually do care and have been thinking about what it's like for people like me. And then I mentioned this earlier with respect to the question, but ways to promote mattering practices, what sort of things that can be done at individual or community level. There's no better way to send a message to somebody they matter than to spend time with them. Any time is quality time. My brother, who's younger than me, never went to university, but is wise beyond his years, once said to me, the most valuable thing you can give somebody is your time, because everybody only has a fixed amount of that, no matter how much it is. And one of the things that's come through in developmental research in families where there's been a divorce is the sheer amount of time that parents are now spending with their children goes into their sense of feeling of mattering, especially if it's a situation where the father just is not the main custodial parent at the time, or there's a stepfather. The biological father, the amount of time spent goes into that feeling of being valued and still being cared for. I mentioned about the importance of being a great listener, acknowledging when somebody's been away, basic things like remembering key dates or interests so that you're trying to send that message of individual attention and value. And I say to parents, modeling and encouraging giving to others. I think the best thing families could do when it's safe to do so and there's an opportunity is that the whole family volunteers so that it's seen as a value that radiates through to the children. Micro practices, teachers have talked to me a lot about this in terms of just small things that can happen. Educators do this when they can. Knowing kids' names. The principal at our local school with almost 1,000 kids somehow knew the names of every child and their sibling. The amazing Peggy Morrison. I sometimes say, what would Peggy do? And that's what needs to be done. Just acknowledging somebody, giving them a nod if you're passing them in the hallway so that they see that they are recognized. If somebody seems to be too quiet or you haven't heard, just reaching out and asking how they're doing. Key thing in the pandemic. Not playing favorites is a big thing that I get from the Dirac family in terms of what happened there, with one brother being treated as special and the other treated as non-existent. For professors, I talk about, or any organization person, answering emails as best you can, but just generally checking in with the person in some way, some fashion. Um, some other possibilities just to show you the range of things. The lost art of note writing. Don't send an email if you can send a handwritten note, which shows again you took the time and the effort to do something that's no longer practiced all that much. Unexpected favors and considerations where somebody doesn't ask for something, but you figure out what they might need and you just address it. That expressing appreciation, and also very important, especially with young people, holding them to account when necessary. Mattering isn't a free ride. It's not, sort of a negligent parenting by being too permissive. Um, it's sometimes saying, hey, I care about you enough to tell you that you're messing up or you need to shape up. And Rosenberg talked about this in a study that showed that the kids who felt the best in terms of their sense of mattering were the ones who either had a great report card that they took home or had a not so great report card, but their parent got in their face about it and said, hey, we got to help you improve. And they talked about it and they gave attention to it. The worst off kids in that study were the ones who the parent didn't seem to care, didn't say anything about the bad report card, didn't seem to take any interest in this. And in our book, I talk about this as experience being the one for Al Pacino, the famous actor who said that nobody ever seemed to notice him and the family. And it was his teacher again who essentially saved him and put him on the path to his preeminent acting career. And of course, the other message, the flip side, is limit the destructiveness of anti-mattering, not criticizing people, especially criticizing in terms of fixed attributes like, harsh things like saying to somebody they're stupid. Sarcastic tone of voice will come through in a way that can be demeaning and devaluing, or just talking over someone and not letting them say what they're trying to finish. No phubbing, the big problem these days, looking at your phone, not paying attention. This is something that I saw once when our daughter and I were going into a movie and we're in a lineup and I see a dad and it looks like a situation where the dad is getting some time with the daughter on a Saturday, and the 20 minutes in the line, he spent the entire time on his cell phone and while she's looking up, just desperate for any sort of attention. Social comparisons are very, very destructive in terms of devaluing somebody's sense of worth as well. And like I said, don't be so busy that you've got no time whatsoever, which is the ultimate feeling of not mattering. I just watched a John Wayne movie this past week where this was the theme, and his sons got into trouble because they felt that their dad, the sheriff, only cared about catching the bad guys. So they became bad guys themselves, and then the dad had to finally give them the attention that they so badly needed. Now, I end my book and I talk about this. We've got this giant UN Convention of the Rights, 54 stated rights of children. I really do believe that the 55th one should be the right to matter. And that, of course, applies to everyone. And I do believe that we have an obligation when we talk about Convention of Rights to provide the sense of mattering and the security that comes along with that sense of mattering. So I'm almost there, almost ready for questions. But I wanted to reiterate, it's important to have self-care and for you to work on your own sense of mattering. We saw how important it was in terms of one of the poll questions. So find ways that you will be able to enhance your own sense of mattering. And you can just read these. If you can get a copy of the PowerPoint, you can just read these statements. It's like Stuart Smalley used to be on Saturday Night Live, and say them to yourself if you have to. But ideally, I think getting involved with young people or community more generally in things that matter to others and the community will help build that sense of mattering. And I always like to end with this. This is a school where they were asked to indicate how they know they feel they matter. I feel like I matter at school when somebody really listens to me. I can trust someone with a secret. When I help someone out, if you go right up there. And also, I want to underscore that this is a way of lifting people up out of whatever their situation might be as a starting point. That if they get that sense of feeling of mattering in general, but also in school, their community, their family, the more the merrier, then it's only a recipe for good things or more protection from the bad things. And there's the book. I show that not because I want to tout the book, but I just want to emphasize that sense of interconnection and how mattering brings people together rather than pulls them apart. And there's my email if you want to contact me with questions and say, what were you talking about when you went too fast, Professor Flett? Okay, I hope there's a little time for questions and comments.
Yes,
Stories about what people are doing to promote
there
mattering.
is. Yes, it would be great to do a little of both. And Gordon, if you wouldn't mind to stop sharing your screen,
Okay.
and then we can see you.
I'm into Neverland here now.
Uh-oh.
Uh,
And it's at the
There
bottom.
we
I
go.
think there you go. Super.
There.
There we go. And anybody who would like to have their video turned on is welcome to, or not. And so I want to remember, Gina, you can help me. There was a couple questions. There's some good comments, but there was a question about if you thought that one of the issues with people leaving the workplace, as they have at least in this country during the pandemic, had anything to do with them feeling like they didn't matter anymore.
Oh, yeah, yes. And the book, I have a chapter on mattering at work. And if I get any spare time, I also want to write a book that focuses on this very thing and from a business organizational side of things. Just as a story to underscore this, one of our best friends had some health problems, and he was somebody who was senior in the organization in a sales position. And this happened in Ontario. So they essentially used the pandemic as an excuse for laying him off, and at a time when he's got health problems. And I thought, here's somebody who should have been cherished and valued and nurtured through this difficult time. And instead, this harsh treatment to the point where he ended up having to talk to labor lawyers, and eventually they saw that they couldn't actually just do this. But it's not when somebody's laid off either. It's also the retirement aspect that when people retire, if they've got so much of their sense of value and worth wrapped up in what their occupation is, it can be such a tremendous change for them that can overwhelm them.
Yeah.
Ideally, they'll have a sense of being able to contribute to their community. I was talking about this with um, our friend who also is our accountant. And she has a father who's a retired teacher who retired with four other teachers. And within a year, he was the only one still with us.
Hmm.
And they said the reason was that he stayed involved, he was tutoring kids. The others didn't feel like they mattered because it was all focused on teaching. So
Um, one
it's really a problem.
one of the questions that just popped up from Alyssa is, why do you think the feeling of not mattering has been such a big problem for youth in multiple nations and for numerous decades?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I had 100 minutes to answer it, but
Yeah.
um, there's multiple contributing factors. Certainly, if you come from a family where you don't matter, that's going to be it. Adverse early life experiences. I know there's research and data in Maine on that as well. Um, I often think it's a matter of parent education when it's an issue with parents, that they need to know that they can play such a valued role, and they assume that their child feels like he or she matters when they might not. Um, some data I've talked about in other presentations, we asked that sample where the 30% said they felt like they didn't matter or they weren't sure. We asked parents how many kids feel this way, and the parents said like 8% said that maybe kids don't feel like they matter. And that
Yeah.
means there's a lot of young
That's
people
a
walking
disconnect.
around who
Yeah.
feel this way, but aren't telling anybody or showing it. And parents are assuming everything's fine. But
That's that. Yeah.
I think
That's
But we
societal
also had a few different people talk about the impact of social media on mattering, especially with our youth. And if you have any thoughts about that or any suggestions on what we can do as community members about it.
what I would suggest, there's a little bit of data suggesting that there's a small but significant correlation between feelings of not mattering and social media use. One of those papers is in the special issue. And I have some data with my Italian colleagues that does this, and we're doing a follow-up study on this shortly. But I think it's very important to sort of do like the same things you would do with media awareness for kids, um, so that they know you don't believe somebody who sends you harsh messages or excludes you. They don't know you. That's a key thing. Also, know that when somebody's acting as if their life matters and yours don't, we know from our perfectionism research, there's a thing called perfectionism self-presentation, where idealized images of what life is about are being put out there, and then kids are comparing. So I think it's just important to proactively talk about it. Tell young people to get off of any system where they're getting this kind of a message, and most importantly, talk to other people about it. Don't just feel this way. And the key thing about if you develop that sense of mattering is that they're less likely to internalize this. So that's where they're all tied in together. Just one example I'll give with this is, I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago when Kelly Clarkson had a baby, and the British media, as they're known to do, were fat shaming her, and actually compared her to farm animals. I can't believe what some of these things that people say, from the sanctity of their own keyboards. So they asked her, Kelly, what do you think about this? Excuse me. And she says, I don't like it. Nobody likes it. Who would like it? But the people who matter to me, I matter to them. And this is what gets me through these sorts of things. And, I actually had the chance to see her live in person along with actually the Bidens, when we had an event in Toronto. And I thought, there's somebody entertaining. Obviously, they get the benefit of knowing that they can entertain and make people happy, which I think goes into that mattering in another way. But then you're a target for these things. And young people think that it's great to be famous. It's great to be this and that. I think also just helping understand who might be the person who's sending those negative messages might build a sense of empathy as well that helps deflect away from the message's impact on oneself.
Gordon, I know we're almost out of time, but
Yes,
I really did want to end on examples of what's happening in our
yes,
community. And so even if people want to stay on a little bit longer, I think that would be great. Um,
yeah, sure.
and so if anybody wants to volunteer to share something, I know we have Keeney Tinkham from Maine Resilience Building Network. We have lots of schools that I know do wonderful things on a daily basis. I'm gonna start us off by sharing something that one of our schools did. One of the counselors, I think, Gina, correct me if I'm wrong, it was Mary Testa at York High School. She wrote down the names of all of the students, hand wrote on separate pieces of paper, and put it up on a wall, very similar to something you showed us in your presentation, and basically said that you matter and we're here for you. And so there are things like that. I know in other schools, finding out what the kids care about, and then everybody knows what those sparks or natural highs are, and then that would be one of the things that they could engage with the young person about on a random basis. But if Keeney, if you or anybody on the call wants to unmute or in the chat share something small or something bigger that has happened in your community, it would be great to hear those things. I know we're at the end here, but I would love to end on a
Yes.
on a high note. Although you did have some really good suggestions, Gordon. Gina, maybe you can give us a little bit more. On our website, there is a video of kids sharing what helps them feel like they matter, which I can share with people. But Gina, if you want to just talk about that briefly, that'd be great.
Follow-up. I just wanted to do a quick follow-up on what you shared about the bulletin board. Sometimes we complicate things and we try to come up with some big program instead of doing an act like that bulletin board where, Ms. Testa put everyone's name and said, the world is a better place because you're in it. We're here for you. But what was interesting is how many times they saw students stop and look for their names,
Right.
even on video camera. They were all stopping and trying to find their names between classes when they didn't think anybody was there.
So yeah, very simple. I'm sure it took her a lot of time, but simple
600
concept.
students, that's a lot of writing.
Yeah. Keeney, did you
Yeah,
want to
thank
share?
you. I'd be happy to share a local coalition that joined Sally and Gina's coalition a couple of weeks ago at a network meeting, talked about involving youth in economic planning within their communities. So they were really part of engaging adults and having a voice on where they wanted their community to go moving forward, to be youth friendly, which I thought was a wonderful, again, bringing youth voice to the solution. And I just want to acknowledge, thank you. And it's just so great hearing you again, Gordon, and being reminded of all this research and just little acts, but really important acts, right? To reach youth and others, our coworkers, people today coming out of the pandemic, to feel like you matter. It's really critical that we pause and give notice to people in an authentic way. So I thank you for that. We will be releasing a youth thriving guide from Merben, work that we've been doing in the last almost a year now, a guide for community action, which will provide tools and resources for any community, lay people, coalitions, healthcare, but it's just getting people to be able to move forward with a real clear vision, so youth feel like they matter and they're part of the solution of helping communities understand what they want, to feel like they matter in the community where they live. So this coalition work that is being talked about today is really a great example, but just making sure that we bring youth's voice to the table and all these populations that are typically not represented or asked to engage to be part of community solutions. So I just want to highlight that. So you can visit our website to learn more about that as well.
Thank
But
you.
thank you. Yeah, it's great.
Can I just interject there about?
Yes, please.
Just want to quickly say, the definition of hope I'm talking about, I didn't get into, but it's Snyder's definition of hope, where it's not just the positive, good feelings, but also things you can do, what he called pathways that you can, so that, that guide about what can be actually put into action, strategies, routes, things. And that's what the difference between hope and optimism is. Optimism, well, it's all gonna work out, but hope is, finding ways to make it happen so it'll all turn out with that hopeful outcome.
Oh, can we just share that such a lovely, and it making me feel hopeful. So that was a good definition. That someone shared, Kristen said, another idea for faculty team meeting is listing all students' names by class, division, or what have you, and giving each teacher or staff member a sticker and having them place the sticker next to the students whom they feel connected to in a meaningful way. And how amazing would that be to be able to quickly show in a visual who might not have a connection with somebody?
Yes, I know of schools that have done that. I'm not sure if Erin is still on. I know Noble, it makes sure that all the kids have someone that they have a team that looks after them and makes sure that they are not in need of extra help. And so to do it in a visual way and to make sure that everybody has someone is wonderful.
Well, I would like to also recognize all our school people and all of our community people here, but Becky Duranis, who's here. Becky, if you can wave. She's always making her students feel like they matter and making us feel like we matter, because she put this event out on the York Community Dialogue and shared it with everybody. And so we want to say thank you for making us feel like we matter, but also trying to bring mattering in this important topic to everybody. So thank you, Becky.
Good one, Gina. Yes, thank you, Becky.
Thank you for the work you guys doing for all this. This is so important, and we're seeing it. I'm a middle school teacher at York Middle School, and we're seeing the need for more and more of this. So I love all the ideas. I love that sticker idea. So I'm going to bring a lot of these things back to our school and our team of what we can be doing. I'm screenshotting things. So thank you guys. Thank everybody here.
Great. And maybe that's a good place to end, unless if somebody else can interrupt if they want to. But I just want to remind everyone, Gordon is generously said, I'm going to share his PowerPoint with everyone. It's going to be on our website. Also a recording of this. And also, Gordon, I would love to invite you back. This is a conversation that, because of Keeney's great work, I mean, we're just going to keep talking about youth mattering and ways to make it systemic and practical and useful in our communities. We lack a lot of resources in Maine, but we have a lot of people that want to continue with this. So hopefully you'll come back and we can have, now that we've learned all this, we can have a practical conversation about what we're doing.
I'd be more than glad, excuse me, more than glad. So I'm choked up by the invitation. But, you know, it's especially helpful for me to hear the practical ways of putting it into action. I am, you know, I haven't talked with one publisher's approached me, but I am going to be writing a book about children and youth and mattering, because I think that's what's needed in the literature next. And of course, everybody's going to want suggestions, as everybody does. And the creativity always amazes me in terms of how it gets put into action, and also what can come from the youth themselves in terms of what they think about how this can be done and what they see as practical. You know,
And that's a good point. We yes, as Gina says, we have heart, we lack resources. You know, maybe we can have this conversation again with youth in the room, because that would be important. And I'm going to end on this little video that I mentioned earlier that we did. It's very homemade, but we asked the kids what youth mattering means to them. And so I'm going to just share that. And if people can stay to watch it, that would be great. And if I would love for you to see it, Gordon, it's only a minute long. So I'm just going to put that on. Let's see if I can do this correctly. Gina, tell me if you can see the YouTube screen.
No, I can't.
Uh-oh, okay. That's because I'm not sharing correctly. Okay, now I'm going to share it correctly.
Yep.
Okie doke. There we go. It doesn't take long, so stay with us here.
People take time out of their day to hang out with me and socialize with me. I feel like I matter when someone shows active listening skills so that I feel heard. And I feel like I matter when people take time out of their day to check in on me and make sure I'm doing okay.
So I just wanted to share that. I think what's really great about it is those kids have never heard you speak, Gordon, but they mentioned everything that you said that's mattering: being needed, being asked for help, being acknowledged, being spoken to, having somebody check in on them. So the kids know what it means to feel mattered, and we just need to do it for them and for each other. So thank you so much again for being here, Gordon. It's been such an honor to meet you and be able to speak with you and learn from you, and we hope to see you again soon. We definitely will, and hopefully in person, because you're not far away. So thanks again, and thank you everyone for being here and sharing.
Thanks, Sally, and everyone. And I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. Take care. You matter for sure, as everyone on this call does. Thank you.
I gotta get a copy of that recording for sure.
Okay, we'll get it to you. We appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Gordon.
Here.
Thanks, Sally. Thanks.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Kini, for inspiring all of this. We appreciate you. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.